Thanks a lot for having me along. It's great to be back at Politics in the Pub, especially sitting alongside my supervisor, even if he did just defame two of our greatest treasurers, Scott Morrison and of course Costello, who delivered all those surplus budgets with his rivers of gold. And he did talk just the other night about the forgotten people earning $200,000 a year. And in a way, Frank, this was a budget for the forgotten people. If we look ahead 7 years. So, my name's Troy Henderson. My official title is Economist at the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. Bit of a mouthful. Some of you might know it as the Jim Stanford Institute. Jim is my boss and Frank's good mate, and he certainly does a lot of fantastic work. But I definitely say that sitting here tonight, I'm a political economist. I've spent a lot of time studying political economy with this man here, and I hopefully bring that perspective to the budget. But I also will give a little bit of an insider's perspective to what it's like, to what it's like being down there during this time of year. And I'm also, perhaps some of you would judge the way I'm dressed tonight as looking like a bit of a wanker, because I'm the only one wearing a navy blue suit. But I wanted to give you a visual sartorial impression of what Canberra looks like on budget day and budget night. Everywhere, just an army of clones of thousands of men wearing blue suits. But then I do have this Troy Henderson ACTU stakeholder name badge to partially redeem myself. But I'll now sit down. I hope me sweating in this suit was worth that gag. I'll try some more material as we go. Okay, well here's the next one. Canberra, I think of the budget as Canberra's Easter, Christmas and New Year's sort of rolled into one. It's about sin, it's about redemption, it's about budget miracles, it's about presents, and it ends with a big piss up at the end. So if you're wanting to go out in Canberra, I would suggest going down on budget night. Or one of these coming years, because the pubs are certainly overflowing. As Frank mentioned, I was in one of the lockups. So I didn't actually know this before going down, but it's lockups plural. So all the political parties have lockups for their caucuses. There's the massive journalists lockup, which goes for 6 hours, which I think that's a fair bit of torture for 6 hours, at Parliament House. And then there's the so-called stakeholders lockup, where I was, at the Hyatt Hotel, with a few hundred people, everyone from ACTU, Get Up, environmental groups, church groups, business groups, accountancy firms, business council, every lobby group or stakeholder you can think of. And again, if you get a chance to go to the lockup, go to the one at the Hyatt Hotel, because they give you sausage rolls and sandwiches, whereas the journalists didn't get any food and had to pay for their tea and coffee. That's not a way to endear yourself to journalists. Okay, so I was in the stakeholder lockup. 3:30 we got let in, and you cannot get let out until the Treasurer starts speaking. So you're there for 4 hours, and it's sort of like being in a massive exam where the Treasury officials are the invigilators, making sure you don't do anything dodgy, you can't take your phones in or anything like that. And they do give you this delightful budget tote bag, which contains all of the budget papers, recommended bedtime reading for all of you, and some glossy brochures, and fortunately for me at least, a USB stick that you can plug into your laptop and get cracking on reading the papers. And so I spent my 4 hours in there, and I was working on notes focused on labour issues, which is really what the Centre for Future Work, unsurprisingly, is focused on. And then I rushed off after the budget, after the lockup we were released. Didn't hear the budget speech, haven't read the budget speech, probably won't read the budget speech, and went off to write my notes to send to my boss, Jim, who would then turn it into a quick analysis of this budget. So that's enough about the lockup. The budget papers, again, I'll skip over this very quickly, but you get an overview, which really gives you a sense of the whole budget, so that's certainly where to start. Budget paper number 1, which focuses on aggregates, you know, the deficits, the surpluses, the debt levels, or revenue expenditure, etc., but at the aggregate level. Budget paper 2 focuses more specifically on budget measures for that year. Budget paper 3 is on state-Commonwealth relations, which, can all sound kind of boring, but it is important, as the Commonwealth does give $120 billion a year to the states and territories, and it's a big portion of their funding that goes into our schools and hospitals. Budget paper number 4 about agency resourcing, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that I won't bother going into with you. But I do want to make a couple of points about the budget and numbers, and maybe particularly, I don't want to prejudge the audience, but I think it might be slightly left-leaning, and I just say a few things that are important for progressives, lefties, to engage with some of the numbers. So you have reference points for your analysis of budgets. So, for example, big numbers, right? So you want to know that the federal budget for this financial year, for this budget year, is $488 billion. It's quite a lot of money, right? Any of us would be happy with that as a salary. But it helps you put things in perspective. The point is not to win budget trivial pursuit, right? The point is to know that New Start, the support we give to the unemployed, the least advantaged in our society, the so-called dole bludgers that we hear a lot about, is $10 to $11 billion a year. Okay, so we need to put that $10 to $11 billion against the $488 billion, which is the federal budget. Then I want to get on to small numbers. So small numbers can have absolutely no macroeconomic significance at all and still be some of the nastiest things you can find in the budget, right? So, I suppose some of you would have heard about more ABC cuts that would please many people on the far right, maybe not even on the far right, just on the right. And there are a lot of other, if you cut 2,000 staff from a government department, it can have a really negative impact. If you take $5 million off rape crisis shelters, that's going to have a direct, really bad impact. No macroeconomic significance at all, but at a human level, it has an enormous significance. So we need to be able to keep our minds on the big numbers and the small numbers, what I'd call the small nasties. Then, what have I got left, Frank? 3 minutes?
Go.
Okay. Then, pardon? Okay. Then I wanted to go from big numbers to small numbers to odd numbers. So one of the things that I felt kind of smug, kind of nerdy way that I found in the budget paper is an apparent $1 billion cut in this year's budget to unemployment assistance, right? And that's out of an $11 billion budget, cutting it to $10 billion, that's not a trivial sum of money. And the explanation in the budget papers was, I'll read it to you because it wasn't very compelling. So it is a 10.8% cut in real terms, and these changes reflect compliance activities, including the budget measure social welfare debt recovery. So then you go and look up that budget measure and see how much that's meant to raise. And it's not meant to raise very much. So I went to a guy called Dave Richardson, who Frank knows well at the Australia Institute. His first budget was Frank Crean's 1973. Delivered a surplus. So, fairly experienced guy. He couldn't explain this. Then we went to the departmental officials who were there. They couldn't explain it. Then they called someone at Treasury or someone higher up in their department, and they can't explain it. So I don't have an answer for you why that is the case now, but it stands out. Even with a deficit or surplus of, 10 billion, 14 billion, or a 2 billion surplus, $1 billion is a significant sum that needs to be explained. So looking for odd numbers is something that the economic nerds do. And then there are dodgy numbers, which are perhaps the most important numbers in any budget. And we know that the budget is an economic statement, it's a balance sheet, but it's also a political document, as Frank said. And one of Frank's great former colleagues, I suppose he's still a colleague in some way, Evan Jones, was particularly fierce in his critique of some of the dodgy numbers that are used in federal budgets, where you have this thing called the forward estimates. That's right, isn't it? My mind went blank. Which it just means 4 years, right? A lot of jargon, it just means 4 years. And you often see in those forward estimates that the last 3 years, things suddenly start going really well. You know, economic growth picks up to trend 3%, wages pick up, inflation gets right in the middle of the RBA's target band, and all these things beautifully coincide in 3 or 4 years' time, and that makes all of the magic in a budget like ScoMo's possible, right? That makes the budget surpluses, the stabilising net debt to GDP, and delivering tax cuts all at the same time. These potentially dodgy numbers, we can't say for a fact that they're dodgy numbers, but there's a good track record of dodgy numbers in economic forecasting, isn't there, Frank? As we say, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And that's something that my boss, Jim Stanford, who's focused a lot on wage stagnation in Australia over the last 6 years, 6 years, has particularly focused on these rosy forecasts about wages growth. And I'll give a final plug to my organisation, Centre for Future Work. You can read our budget briefing note there, which goes into great detail about how cumulative wages growth is much better for the average worker than little tax cuts. Yeah, that's the key point. And the numbers bear that out, and Jim has crunched the numbers, and I encourage you to have a look. Okay, I better speed up. I've gone for longer than 10 minutes, haven't I? Right, the budget itself, you got a sense that some of the political commentators, at least as I was watching it afterwards when I was writing up my notes, they found the budget maybe even a little bit boring, you know, in its short-term implications. But as Frank mentioned, the long-term implications, and not even the long-term, medium-term implications of this type of budget are anything but boring. But we also see it in, you know, we have the cycle of budgets. So this is a so-called pre-election budget. It's got sweeteners in there and this tax credit really for low-income earners that would deliver, you know, between $4 and $10 a week, but it's paid in a lump sum, so you might get $200, $300, $530 a year, is small beer compared to these far larger planned tax cuts in the kick in 6 or 7 years' time, if they get passed, which to me I'd say is extremely unlikely. The other slightly odd thing about these small tax cuts is they don't seem to come in until next financial year. Like, you'll get your tax credit, which is after the election. So as an election sweetener, I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense, but that's, you know, that's my silly political economy hat on. Okay, the medium-term budget cuts, as Frank said, would cost cumulatively $140 billion over a decade, and you'd see someone on $40,000 a year and someone on $200,000 a year paying the same marginal tax rate, which is obviously going to have an extremely poor impact on inequality, which, as Frank and so many others have documented, has increased markedly under the neoliberal period over the last 40 years. Australia Institute analysis shows that 62% of the tax cuts would go to the top 20% of income earners. In fact, the biggest gains go to the top 3%. So that's it's pretty blunt. But this will redeem it for you. Next year, we're possibly going to have a $2 billion surplus. And who isn't excited about that? That's 0.1% of GDP, which you know, will just do wonders for ordinary Australians around the country. Sorry if you can't detect my sarcasm. The last thing I wanted to talk about is this so-called cap on tax to GDP of 23.9%. Now, when you hear that, you think, oh, that's a scientific figure, isn't it? 23.9%. That's exactly what the tax to GDP ratio should be for the federal government. And how did they come up with that? Well, it's the average of the tax to GDP ratio from the introduction of the GST under John Howard until the GFC. So it is a completely arbitrary and meaningless tax threshold. But its political importance, as Frank was saying, is that it's a way of ratcheting down tax, which then becomes an argument for reducing spending on social services, education, unemployment benefits, all of the things that everyone in the room cares about. And we already know Australia's the 8th lowest taxing country in the OECD, so the idea that Australia is a high taxing country and we can't go on under this terrible burden is complete and utter nonsense. Okay, my final, I've summed up several times, that's always a good speaker's tip, that you keep summing up, but I really am summing up now. You know, we have to ask these big questions about when we look at a budget, when Frank says it's a statement about priorities, about what kind of society do we want to live in. You know, do we accept that a 5% unemployment rate is just normal, or an 8.5% underemployment rate is just normal, the highest it's been since the 1970s, quadrupled since the 1970s? Do we accept rising inequality? You know, that is a political and social decision that confronts us all. Now, the budget, this year's budget, provides a clear indication of the coalition's view of what kind of society they want. One of rising inequality, reduced public amenity, reduced public services, investment in education and jobs. But recent surveys that some of you may have read by Per Capita, the think tank, and The Guardian show that Australians, there's overwhelming support for paying a bit more tax to put some more money into education, healthcare, aged care. Even, it was a little bit of a surprise to me, but there was even majority of support in the Per Capita survey for payments on social security. And I think when we get to the point when even the great Johnny Howard says we need to lift the rate of New Start, we've reached a point in society where we are not looking after the least advantaged at all, and I think most of us in this room would agree that we should be. Thanks.